The Philosophy of On Pain by Ernst Jünger. There are several great and unalterable dimensions that show a man's stature. Pain is one of them. It is the most difficult in a series of trials one is accustomed to call life. Whenever one approaches the points where man proves himself to be equal or superior to pain, one gains access to the source of his power and the secret behind his dominion. Tell me your relation to pain, and I will tell you who you are. Ernst Jünger was most known for his World War I memoir, A Storm of Steel, in which he depicts the conditions of the fighting man on the fronts in France, the Western Front specifically, and his own experiences during the war. He was a highly decorated war hero. He won the Pour le Mérite for gallantry in action, and he overcame life and death situations many times. He lost many friends. He would be in, let's say, a unit of 100 men, and over half of them would die in battle, but he would make it through somehow. Shells would go off feet away from him, blowing him back, and still he would live. I believe on one occasion he had a gunshot wound which actually hit his head, but it just went high enough so that it didn't enter into his brain. It sort of just skinned the top of his head. So he was very, very lucky to be alive. So I think with On Pain, he has a perspective that most people won't have. Being close to death in so many occasions and being in very high levels of suffering and pain, on the fronts of the Western Front, you really were living a very, very difficult existence. You were in trenches that were full of water, so your clothes were always wet. The food was old, or there wasn't much of it. It was cold, or it was really warm. It was hard to sleep with artillery fire and the sound of gunshots. So he lived a life of suffering during World War I. So he has a very, very interesting perspective towards pain specifically. And I think one of the things I liked in the beginning of the essay is he quotes the book Bushido, which was written in 1900, and it was written by, and I might be saying his name wrong, and I probably am, Inazo Notibe, or something like that. And he also wrote another book, I forget the name of, but he was a very famous writer who was sort of recounting the samurai spirit in Japan, as during the early 1900s they were undergoing vast technological advancement and industrialization. So anyway, Jünger quotes that book in the beginning of the essay, and the quote is, "Does a little booby cry for an ache? The mother scolds him in this fashion. What a coward to cry for a trifling pain. What will you do when your arm is cut off in battle? What when you are called upon to commit harakiri?" So I thought that was a funny little thing to begin with. You just imagine this little kid, crying because he fell down. His mother's like, "Well, you might have to commit ritual suicide one day. You might have to take people's lives in battle and have your own limbs dismembered," right? It reminds me of the old the Spartan saying, where the mother sending her son off to battle would say, "Come back with your shield or on it." So from the beginning, Ernst Jünger, he's firing full auto. But just to sort of analyze the first big quotes of the essay regarding pain, it is interesting to think about quantifying, or sort of determining the quality of man based on his ability to overcome pain. If we think about human innovation and just the rise of any civilization, it always came with great sacrifice. And what is sacrifice if not undergoing pain, if not feeling pain and overcoming it, right? The warrior in battle has hours of training behind him, hours of painful running to build his endurance, of painful slaps of practice swords on his skin. You're undergoing pain every day to train for war. And of course, when you're actually fighting in battle, you experience very real physical pain, whether it's exhaustion, feeling your lungs on fire, tasting the blood in your throat, or if it's literally having your arm slashed or your head bludgeoned, right? You're feeling real physical pain. And to overcome pain is the sacrifice for victory, essentially. It's the pain of preparation and the pain of actual competition. So it's interesting to think about life as a series of overcoming pain. If you've ever read Yukio Mishima's Sun and Steel, he talks about each little bit of overcoming pain is almost like simulating death. Because when we think about pain really is a sort of precursor to death. We feel pain, and it tells us, if you continue to feel this pain, you're going to get an injury, and that injury could lead to your death. So by overcoming pain again and again, it's all these little simulations of death. It's showing that you can deal with death and overcome it, because nothing good comes easy, right? And all the great things require great risk and sacrifice. So for a civilization to rise, it requires conquest. It requires the defeat of your enemies. And to defeat your enemies, you must go through pain and preparation and during the actual battle with them. Even war aside, to have a strong civilization, you need people out plowing the fields, building roads, building cities. People are undergoing physical labor and, by extension, physical pain to maintain a civilization, a great and powerful civilization. And one of the things that Jünger talks about, and he also discusses this in his book, The Worker, or in German, Der Arbeiter. I don't know if I said that right. And it's a criticism of the sort of modern bourgeois culture which values the longevity of life and security above all. So when you think about the necessity for pain to sort of achieve things, right? To achieve things as an individual and then as a greater collective group, you have to undergo pain and suffering. And the modern bourgeois cultural value is averse to pain. It's a great aversion to pain, and that's a sort of modern bourgeois liberal value. And Jünger discusses this, and he says, nothing is more certain and unavoidable than pain. And when we discuss pain, it's almost like we sort of, and especially with the background and the environment of being in a bourgeois society, at least in the developed world, you almost get this like queasy feeling discussing pain and breaking down the mechanics of it. And that's because we've been conditioned to fear pain. The comforts of modernity are not earned through sacrifice like the means of survival in the past. We take comfort and all these different pleasures that we have access to as a sort of precondition to existence. We take it for granted. Whereas in the past, just to survive, people had to sacrifice so much to get a sliver of what we have access to today. And he kind of builds on this idea, and that there's no amount of intellectualizing that can avoid this sort of physical reality of pain. No amount of bourgeois culture can get rid of the fact that you will feel pain at some point in your life, real physical pain, because it's an unavoidable aspect of life, and it's especially an unavoidable aspect if you want to transcend to a higher plane of existence. And no amount of avoiding pain, no amount of structuring your society around comfort and around commodities is going to be able to intellectualize pain away. The intellectual who avoids pain and is frail in the body, and again, I'm going to point back to Sun and Steel, Yukio Mishima, the intellectual can never really, it'll always be a mystery to him. This is what Mishima talks about. He talks about pain and all these different physical elemental struggles will be a mystery to the intellectual, because if the intellectual hasn't experienced it themselves, then they could only guess at this and that. And the intellectual who is weak in the body, of course, with feelings of resentment, will probably look at the strong individual who overcomes pain and encounters pain and find ways to critique it. But no amount of intellectualizing will get rid of pain. It is unavoidable. Another quote from Jünger that I really enjoyed was, in war, when shells fly past our bodies at high speeds, we sense clearly that no level of intelligence, virtue, or fortitude is strong enough to deflect them, not even by a hair. The sacrifices required for the safe, secure, and comfortable lifestyle are forgotten, like I talked about earlier. The modern man does not know the price required to live his life. All this all this kind of all these sacrifices are forgotten. However, when you're in battle, as Jünger discusses, all that goes out the window. All these thoughts regarding comfort and security, if those thoughts stay with you, you're probably, as soon as you hear gunfire, you're gonna try to, if you try to run, you're gonna go up, and then the enemy's gonna see your head and shoot you. You have to follow your instincts. You almost have to accept the chance of there's a probability of you dying, and no amount of intellectual sort of rationalization is going to stop that bullet from taking you out. And sometimes you can't do anything, even physically you can't do anything to avoid death, and you're just going to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and you're going to be shelled by enemy artillery. So there is this sort of detachment, and then this big sort of flash into reality that he talks about. Another good quote: "Born in full enjoyment of all these blessings now taken for granted, it seems to us as if, in truth, rather little has changed." And this is talking in regards to sort of what I was saying, is that with a lot of the privileges we're afforded in modern society, we don't realize all the things it took to gain those privileges, all the sacrifice, all the pain, all the suffering, all the death, all the destruction that took place, all the enemies of our ancestors that were slain by their hand. He also says, "The individual is greeted by a wealth of conveniences, such as the path paved for education and a career choice of preference, the free market of labor, and the contractual character of almost all social ties, and the unrestricted freedom of movement. The potential for conflict is thereby greatly reduced." So in nature, where we're trying to survive, you almost have to think more, because especially before you had sedentary societies, before people could farm and herd animals, you were always moving where the game was. You're always following the hunt. Wherever there were animals to hunt, that's where you would go. So you're always thinking of new ways to survive. You're always encountering new challenges. But in modern society, with these sort of paths that we're given, almost like the rat race, right? You're given a pretty clear path. Go to high school, you do well in high school, go to a good college, you do well in college, and you go to a good college and you'll get a good job. There's this clear line that you can take. And like he says, the potential for conflict is thereby greatly reduced. So again and again, we're almost forgetting any sort of relationship with pain, because we're being torn further and further from this natural existence of pain in our lives. And yet the sort of natural relationship that man does have with pain is also sort of not fulfilled. So I guess what I mean by that is, we see that society is structured to make life easier and easier. But if we go to evolutionary psychology, our minds were built for a state of nature in which it was not easy to survive. You can kind of look at the Buddhist samsara and building off of that, Schopenhauer's will to life. The reason why we sort of get stuck in these cycles of pleasure is because we were never meant as a species to have such easy access to pleasure. If survival was something that was so difficult, then our evolutionary psychology hasn't quite caught up to having all these things at our disposal. So it becomes very easy to get addicted. It becomes very easy to get complacent with the comfort and the commodities of modern living. So like I said, security that reduces the individual's pain in society doesn't remove the underlying aspects of humanity which require a relationship with pain. So that's that evolutionary psychology that I'm talking about. Jünger says, "Boredom is nothing other than the dissolution of pain in time." We almost go bored. So if we think about why so many people in the West or the developed world are depressed today, well, it's because you do need that relationship with pain. You need to experience pain to experience good pleasure, right? Like a meal after working out or after working all day is going to taste better than a meal that you eat after sitting on the couch all day, because our minds think that survival is difficult. We think, okay, well, we have to put everything into survival because that's how humanity has been for the past 300,000 years, up until like 8,000 to 12,000 years ago with the agricultural revolution. We were living nomadic lives where survival is so difficult, and there was no sedentary lifestyle where we could just stay in one place. We're always moving, always having to be on our toes, and this sort of this sort of leads, I think, to this modern increase of anxiety. This anxiety comes from not using that extra energy that we were originally given through evolution to survive. It's because we're not using that evolutionary energy anymore because survival is easy. So instead of like going back, let's say 30,000 years ago, where you're probably on your feet 16 hours a day, walking or running for most of that time. Now, although a lot of our brain structures have changed, there's still that part of our psychology that prepares us to use that 16 hours of energy running and walking and hunting, but now we're not using it anymore. We're just sitting at a desk from 9 to 5, or we're sitting at school, right? So like a lot of kids, I think I was as well, as a young boy, experienced sort of ADD symptoms, right? And modern education sort of frowns upon that, but that's part of our evolutionary psychology. We're always meant to want to be moving. And if anything, I think maybe it's the ones who don't have that proclivity to ADD that are the weirdos, right? So there's that aspect to think about. Boredom is nothing other than the dissolution of pain and time. Without struggle, without some feeling, some relationship with pain, we do grow bored, and we grow anxious, and we grow depressed, because we need that pain for our pleasure to feel good. Pleasure must be earned. Unearned pleasure is something that you grow desensitized and numb to. You look at porn addiction, for example. Somebody who just watches porn nonstop, sitting on their couch, eating their hot Cheetos or whatever, not working out. Well, of course, they're going to get desensitized to something like porn. They're not doing anything with their lives. So when they get this big rush from watching porn, they're going to their brain's dopamine receptors are going to flatline, because, well, what are they doing to earn that, right? Nothing. So the brain just sort of normalizes. Whereas if you had to like fight off a lion every day before you went and did something pleasurable, like have a meal or have sex with a woman, then you're probably going to enjoy it a lot more, because your brain's like, okay, well, this happens, but then afterwards I get this reward. You're literally feeling physical exertion to lead to that reward. So there's a relationship of, okay, pain and suffering, and then reward and pleasure afterwards. So it balances out. But if you're just experiencing pleasure without the pain, then of course you're going to grow bored, and the pleasure is not going to be quite as enjoyable. Our brains are created to balance the chemicals within us, and we play a part in that. If we're not doing our part to balance that, then of course our brain's going to have to step up and work for us, right? So if you think about the modern obsession with mental health, it's probably because we don't have that physical relationship with pain. And again, I'm going to go back to, I'm going back to Sun and Steel by Yukio Mishima. He critiques an over-intellectualism that's present in modern society. He talks about, like I said earlier, you have the frail or fat intellectual, and they're sort of jealous of the strong, almost like the individual that's almost modeled after the heroic archetype. Most people that critique this sort of strong and virile individual critique them because they themselves are frail and weak, and they believe that they don't have the ability to also become strong and virile. And this is very clearly Nietzsche's concept of resentment, like I mentioned before. This jealousy and envy that comes from an individual that thinks they cannot be strong themselves. So they're going to, of course, describe, or they're going to present strength as a vice, as an evil, right? So this sort of obsession with mental health that we have today, I think it comes from this shift from physicality to intellectualism. Mishima talks about it when he discusses the corrosive nature of words, where somebody can kind of avoid experiencing something in reality because they can just write about it. They can create this imaginary world where you might have the pain of the soul instead of the pain of the physical. And that's something I'm going to talk about next. To quote Jünger, he says, "The soul's pain is of an inferior kind. It is among the sicknesses causing a rejection of sacrifice." When we try to avoid physical pain, physical sacrifice for higher ideals and for greater success and victory and all these things, then we become obsessed with the pain of the soul. And the pain of the soul oftentimes gets condensed to someone who's just not experiencing a quote unquote happy life, a pleasurable life. And their lives aren't pleasurable because they don't have that balance of pain and suffering to reward and pleasure. So of course nowadays everybody's depressed. Everybody's has the pain of the soul, right? So naturally, they're going to live lives that are centered around maximizing pleasure as much as possible, avoiding pain, when the real thing that's going to balance out their mental health and make them psychologically stronger is experiencing pain. So like I said in regards to resentment, that's modern man now, that individual who's feels the pain of the soul. They're not happy. They're upset with their lives, and naturally they're going to look for someone to blame. They're looking at someone who's responsible for the pain of the soul. So then you have modern mass societies where everything is structured from the bottom up. The politicians have to appease the individual who looks for comfort, who wants to avoid pain, and naturally you have the result of a decadent society, one where pain and sacrifice are avoided, and instead individuals look to experience more pleasure, avoid pain, and be comfortable. And this is really the issue with sort of liberal mass society, which you see a lot of thinkers like Jünger or Nietzsche criticize. It's when you structure a society around liberal values, and essentially, like we said, bourgeois liberal values are longevity of life, security, individual freedoms, individual access to comfort, then naturally people they look for their own self-interest. They want to be comfortable all the time. They want to be quote unquote superficially happy all the time. So they don't want to sacrifice anymore. What's the point, right? So they start to avoid pain, where Jünger would say pain is something that must be mastered, not avoided. The sort of heroic archetype, you take the heroes in sort of Greek mythology, for example, it took a lot of sacrifice, a lot of pain, and the elements of tragedy to make them a hero. The hero was one who experienced pain for a heroic triumph. They experienced pain, again, like I always say, in preparation and then in actual competition. Pain before battle and pain during battle. And that is something that must be mastered. You must master a relationship with pain. We must master a balance where we have enough pain to make our pleasure worth it, right? To make our pleasure earned. And that's something that I think is neglected in modern man, because like we said, modern man values his comfort above all things. For him, a good life is one which he avoids pain as often as possible. Going off of that, a big part of what Jünger talks about in On Pain as well is also this sort of uniformity of society over time, and whether it be education to the military, and how you earlier in human history sort of have the liberal education. And I want to make a clear distinction, the way I use liberal now compared to the way I use liberal in regards to like the bourgeois culture. So when I say liberal education, I'm specifically talking about an education where they try to teach you a little bit of each subject, a little bit of math, a little bit of science, a little bit of history. Whereas today, we're almost shifting back to education as trades. And this trend could be seen during Jünger's time, and it certainly can be seen today. If you think about the person who has a degree in computer science, for example, that's almost like a trade, or in engineering. Whereas liberal education, if you look at schools like St. John's, for example, which is a liberal arts education, they're teaching a little bit of everything. And I think he's pointing this out because you see man going from the individual to a type. And this is something he talks about a lot in his book, The Worker, the sort of worker type. And within the worker type, you see this uniformity of society into one entity. And this is something he talks about, literally uniformity with the symbolism behind a uniform itself. When someone wears a uniform, the individual becomes part of a larger body. And in his view, it becomes part of a larger body to overcome pain. It's interesting, right? Because if we think of the individual as a type, or somebody doing his specialized trade, then it's almost like they're each these little pieces, these little puzzle pieces fitting into this sort of bigger machine, right? He also talks about how this works both ways, because if the masses, for example, are unorganized and weak, then the same uniformity that allows them to overcome pain also allows them to flee and to retreat quicker if they're part of a weak group. Because he talks about, like, in 1921 or something like that, there was some communist uprising, and there were like 5,000 communist revolutionaries charging a bunch of cops, or like military police. The military police fire a few gunshots in the air and they scare off the entire crowd. One person starts running and the rest start running. So that's one way. Like, when you have this sort of mass uniformed group, if it is organized improperly and weak, then that works against it. If one person's scared, everybody else is scared. It's an army full of sheep. But when used correctly, the uniform builds this camaraderie amongst each individual. If you have a uniformed force, let's take a military, for example, or even like a sports team, right? But let's look at a military. If you have a uniformed force of military men, and let's say they're a platoon or a company, when everyone's wearing the same uniform, you look to your left, to your right, you almost feel like that's an extension of yourself. They are you. The person to the left and right of you is not any different from you. You're all part of one entity. So if they get injured, you feel that pain too. If you get injured, they feel that pain, because you're one unit now. You all look the same. You all start to feel the same. You all start to synthesize a little bit. So if organized correctly, the uniformity of a group can allow them to overcome pain, because now they're working together. They're no longer thinking of themselves as an individual. Their death is not important so much as the death of the entire unit. The victory of the entire unit, the survival of the entire unit, and the triumph of the entire unit is more important than each individual's life. So it's the same thing earlier when we talk about how you can't intellectualize away pain in battle when shells are flying past your heads. Right? Like, you just have to do your role if you want to be successful. So everyone just has to do the role. If they got shot charging the enemy, so be it. The unit goes forward. The unit moves forward, right? So I thought that was pretty interesting. And then another one of his quotes sort of goes back to what I was talking about. The masses have been left with only one liberty, the liberty to consent. So when we're talking about how the bourgeois society is structured, it essentially is a society that has a hierarchy based upon an economic elite. And when you have hierarchies based on an economic elite, based on the bourgeois class, then their legitimacy to rule is dependent upon their ability to provide comfort to the masses, to provide pleasures to the masses, right? And much like a drug dealer and a drug addict, the drug dealer gets the drug addict dependent upon their product. So in a sense, the drug addict is technically free. They can leave whenever they want. Technically, they can stop taking drugs whenever they want, but they're addicted to that, the same way the masses are addicted to comfort and pleasure. So the drug addict, even if he is technically not the slave of the drug dealer, it develops that way, right? The same applies to the bourgeois ruling class and then the masses. They're left with one liberty, the liberty to consent. So when this sort of bourgeois culture is so ingrained in them, one where they are addicted to pleasure, where they're addicted to comfort, then they don't really have their own minds. Like, we know what manufactured consent is, right? With the media, you can distort a people's view, make them think that they're making free and independent decisions, when in reality, like, if you give someone two choices, they only have two choices. Like, technically they have a choice, right? But if you only give them two choices, then they're really not free, are they? Because they can't come up with a third choice or a fourth choice or a fifth choice. So the only liberty is to say yes or no. You can't provide your own opinion, right? You can't provide your own thoughts. So that's something interesting that I thought he brought up. And going off of more of our critiques on bourgeois culture, which values the longevity of life above all, it lacks the ethos of sacrifice, in which martyrdom is encouraged, or in which there is a higher ideal than life, in which material sacrifice grants a victory which transcends the material to the metaphysical. And what I mean by that is, a perfect example would be in Julius Evola's The Metaphysics of War, when he talks about devotio. So it was this practice where the Roman nobility would would clad themselves full of armor, and they would get these big weapons. And it was very similar to what Viking berserkers would do. They would charge into the thick of battle, and they would just fight to the death. But the belief was that if a noble basically was sacrificing his life to the gods, then they would be granted victory in battle. Fate would be on their side. They would, by sacrificing themselves in the material sense, and through that, gaining material victory for their army, they also gain a sort of metaphysical victory for the army, because it is the sacrifice of the material for metaphysical rewards, basically believing that if through the devotio this Roman noble could get the gods to turn the battle in their favor by sacrificing themselves, and everybody else would win. It's no different than martyrdom by, say, like Christians or Muslims in battle, believing this idea of holy war. If I die in battle, I am doing my God's bidding. I am destined for something greater than regular life. And when you have a bourgeois culture, which, like I said, values the longevity of life above all, then you don't have this ethos of sacrifice. You don't have the individuals who are willing to sacrifice themselves materially in order for the greater collective or the greater ideal to transcend and be victorious. Devotion to a higher ideal, which is victory, is what leads men to transcend over death. To do that, he has to accept his fate, and his only concern should be doing well in battle. This is what happens when we go back to sort of what happens when you have a uniformed uniformed military unit, or when you're in battle. You just have to do your job. It doesn't matter that death is around the corner. You just have to do your job. And you see this in what Jünger has to say. He says, only he who feels secure in immediate proximity to death finds himself in the highest state of security. And this is different from the security he talks about in regards to bourgeois culture. This is the sort of true kind of security. Somebody who's truly secure with himself is one who is prepared to die any moment. And if you're comfortable in proximity to death, if you can function with death all around you, then that makes you someone to be reckoned with. That makes you a very high form of an individual. So the big criticism of bourgeois culture is that there is no reason to sacrifice, because essentially a bourgeois culture is one that is secular. So this is after the death of God, as Nietzsche discusses. There's no longer these higher ideals in which society structures itself on. It structures itself entirely upon the material, and not the material even in a sense that the material can transcend into the metaphysical, but just the pure sort of nihilistic material, where there is nothing more. And if there is nothing more, then naturally pleasure is probably going to be the highest ideal, right? And this is interesting because when we think about war, right, just for a purely material sense, it kind of goes into this sort of hypocritical, sort of counterintuitive deal where, for some reason, within a bourgeois society, there always has to be a moralization to war. There always has to be a moral justification for war in a bourgeois society. And it's strange because you'd think in a sort of secular society where in reality, the material, the pure physical existence is what is essentially the sort of centralizing concept of a society. You think, well, why do you have to moralize war, right? But that's, I guess, how the masses are. While your bourgeois hierarchy might kind of understand this reality, they also understand that the common people need some maybe false higher ideals to sort of strive towards. So this is the moral justification of war. And I think what this comes from, and I think this is something that Jünger sort of describes in The Worker, is that the bourgeois class themselves, because they don't believe in any higher ideal, are not willing to sacrifice themselves materially. They don't want to die in battle. They don't want to experience pain because they don't believe there is anything beyond the material. So they have to lie to the masses. They have to lie to the lower classes and convince themselves that they have a duty to do this. They have a duty to go out there and lay their lives on the line. So whereas you had medieval Europe where the aristocracy went and fought the wars. Now it's something that's been regulated to the lower classes. It's like that song "Senator's Son," right? I ain't no senator's son. The senator's sons don't go to fight in Vietnam. The senators don't go to fight in Vietnam. It's the poor factory kid or the poor country kid who goes and fights in Vietnam, right? And when you have the masses fighting, you need to morally justify the war, and Jünger calls this a popular war. So a lot of times you hear, like, for example, in the United States, oh, we're fighting for freedom, right? You have these concepts where you have to make it seem like you are the good guy, you are the hero. You need a moral justification for war. You can't be the aggressor. This is something Jünger talks about in The Worker. The bourgeois does not want to seem to be the aggressor. They always want to seem like they're forced into war, like they have no other choice, right? And that's because they themselves are not willing to sacrifice from war. And there's what's called a cabinet war, which I think can also be utilized by the bourgeois class. But the cabinet war is one in which you have a society that is so militarized that they don't need this moral justification to fight in war. They just do it because they are professional soldiers. They'll fight for whatever outcome, for a desired material end. And I think this can also be applied to, if you take it step away from the bourgeois relationship with war and you look at the more spiritual justification of war, the holy war. It makes me think of Evola's, back to the Metaphysics of War by Evola. He talks about war for war's sake, one in which war is fought for this sort of spiritual ideal. Like in Rome, they had a cult of victory. This is something Evola talks about. In Roman times, they believed victory was directly related to their religion. By attaining victory, they were attaining a victory for their gods, for their faith. So war for war's sake, in a sense, was war for the gods. War for war's sake was because victory is all we want. We want a victory, so we're going to fight a war to attain victory. The material is just an afterthought, right? And when war is removed from the moral zone, and this is a quote from Jünger, it thus has no need to stir up the basic instincts and hatreds that the masses require to go to war at all. And this is what we're sort of talking about between a cabinet war and a popular war, where the bourgeois needs to morally justify a war because they rely on a sort of volunteer army where they have to feel like they're the good guys. Then you have to stir up these instincts of like, oh, I'm going to go fight for freedom, or oh, my country is being attacked, sort of nationalist sentiments, right? And this is a thing I think is interesting with the modern right, is if you're truly far right, you're not quite going to be a nationalist per se, because the Romans weren't nationalists; they were imperialists. They were building an empire where they believed they were the ultimate destined people, right? They were the people chosen for greatness by the gods, and I think that's the truly far right position, is you are chosen above all others, whereas the sort of nationalist perspective is, okay, we're chosen above all others, but we're just going to fight for our own national interests. We're not going to expand, right? Because then once you expand, you become imperialist. I think that's a more right-wing point of view. The sort of like when people say like nationalism's right wing, I really don't think it's super right wing for that reason, because nationalism, if you just stick within the boundaries of your country, is that really exceptional? If you can just hold your national boundaries. No, true exceptionalism is like the Romans, going out and conquering other lands, proving yourselves as the best against other people. And I forget who said it. It might have been Nietzsche or Evola, but they said a lot of times, like we don't display our power to show other people we're powerful. We do it to prove to ourselves that we're powerful, right? So that's sort of this exceptionalism and this war for war's sake. We go out and fight in wars just to prove to ourselves that we are the chosen people, or something like that. Who the hell knows? But at the very least, we can sort of see how a popular war, which has to lie to its people and get them all stirred up, is inferior to the war in which the soldiers, they do their job. Their job is warfare. They're going to fight because that is their duty. They don't ask questions. There's a sort of advantage to that, I think. And anyway, another quote from Jünger is, "The decision over war and peace is the highest sovereign prerogative. As such, it presupposes an army capable of being utilized as an instrument of sovereign will. This relation is imaginable only in a space where there are more important things than pain, and where one knows eternal life is only possible in the face of death." So I think this is sort of building upon what we're saying, right? War is, whether to go to war or not, is is sort of the deal, or that's the question as a leader, right? And to be able to go to war at a moment's notice, or to organize your army to be capable of waging war perfectly, there can't be this. You can't have this overarching bourgeois culture of comfort, longevity of life, those sort of things, aversion to pain, because they're not going to be able to. They're not going to be able to think clearly. They're not going to be able to see things clearly. When you have to, when you have to alter public perspective, for example, to fight in a war, then it's no longer this clear picture. Ultimately, it's going to be sort of fuzzy, like, well, why are we here, right? If you were just to tell your people, like, we're going to war because we believe we are the baddest motherfuckers in the entire world, and we're going to go prove that, or something like that, war for war's sake, or if you just say straight up, like, hey, they have this amount of oil, we need to get this amount of oil so that we can increase our industry to this level, whatever. If you say very clearly why you're going to war, and you don't really lie about it, then and there might be advantages to that. This sort of easy, like, okay, here it is. Here's what we're going to do. I think this sort of relates to what Jünger discusses when he talks about photography, of all things. Jünger's description of photography sort of seems to be this unadulterated record of events, where there's a sort of cold reality presented without the interference of opinion and interpretation. He says that the photograph stands outside of the zone of sensitivity, has a telescopic quality. One can tell that the event photographed is seen by the insensitive and invulnerable eye. It records the bullet in mid-flight, just as easily as it captures a man at the moment an explosion tears him apart. This is our own particular way of seeing, and photography is nothing other than an instrument of our own peculiar nature. Remarkable that this peculiarity is still hardly visible in other areas, such as literature. But if we can expect something more than literature as well as painting, the description of the most minute psychic processes will no doubt be replaced by a new kind of precise, objective depiction. So I think what I unpack from this is that, for example, you take film, it detaches the viewer from what you are seeing in a sense, but also gives that very clear view of what things are without opinion, without interpretation. But it goes both ways. While you see this very clear, like, for example, you see war videotape, you see today, wars today, the Ukrainian war, the Israel-Hamas war, you pretty much can see exactly what's going on because people they're taking videos, they're taking pictures of what's going on. You see it exactly how it is. So you get this unadulterated presentation without, like, opinion and just pure hard, this is what's happening, unless the picture's altered or it's fake or whatever. But for the most part, it's just clear, it's right there. But it also desensitizes you in a way that people in the past, or people who actually experience violence, wouldn't. Because when you look at it through a screen, you don't have the actual threat of danger. There's a difference between watching people fight on a video and actually fighting yourself. So it can desensitize the viewer in a way that the actual individual fighting it might not be desensitized. You see it from a third-person perspective, and it sort of creates a colder type of person. It creates an individual who, while in the Roman arena, you had to watch the gladiator's head chopped off in front of you, and you're kind of thinking to yourself, like, holy shit, this is real. When you watch it from a screen, it's almost like it's not real. Like, it's real, but maybe your mind can't quite depict it's totally real. Like, it's sort of this double-edged sword, right? Where it's more real than reality, but then it's less real than reality, or whatever. But anyway, he also talks about sports. He talks about how sports today possess an element of detachment from their original function. Like, traditionally, sports were a way for men to develop skills necessary for war. Like, whether it be wrestling, javelin throwing, chariot riding, whatever, right? And today's sports, in Jünger's perspective, have become a measurement process of understanding the capabilities of the human body. He says that sports make up only one of the areas where we can observe the hardening, honing, or even galvanizing of the human physique. The desire to see physical beauty in keeping with different standards is no less noteworthy. He talks about the realm of pain being mechanized. And this is sort of like what we talked about earlier, the individual being structured into formations of war that can be sacrificed without regard. So like earlier he talks about these Japanese missiles that are operated by men and these men in these missiles literally fly the missiles and direct them towards their targets. Kind of reminded me of Kamikaze. This book came out like 10 years before World War II, so he's almost predicting kamikaze attacks. But he's discussing how with this aversion to pain, for example, and most individuals don't have that sort of, they have that bourgeois aversion to pain. Then the bourgeois still need to wage war. They still, the senators don't want to send their sons off to battle, so they have to structure society in a way where war can still be done. So now they're sort of instituting certain structures into the lower classes where they're organized for war in a way where they can overcome pain, right? So Jünger talks about, and this book was written in 1934, I believe, so it was on the verge, like 5 years before the start of World War II, and it's sort of, you see the pieces moving towards a potential global conflict. He says that the question thus arises whether we are witnessing the opening act of the spectacle to come, in which life appears as the will to power and nothing less, nothing else. So it sort of goes back to what I'm talking about, like the purely material and nihilistic view of things that you sort of are going to see in a more secular society, right? And then he also says, the practical consequence of this observation for the individual is, despite everything, the necessity to commit oneself to the preparation for war, regardless of whether he sees in it preparatory stages of ruin, or believes he sees on the hills covered with weather-worn crosses and wasted palaces the storm preceding establishment of new orders of command. So I guess to sort of tie this essay altogether, there's certain contradictory elements of it, I think, but the overall message that I think I get out of it is that for man to evolve to that next stage of transcendence, first of all, he needs to have a balanced relationship with pain, one in which he is able to confront pain and overcome it. Going back to what we mentioned with Sun and Steel and Mishima, when Mishima did, like, for example, martial arts training, whether that be boxing or kendo, swordsmanship training, it's a simulation of death and a simulation of war. You have this relationship with pain where you simulate death, but you're almost like you have these mini simulations of death where you're overcoming death by overcoming pain. And through that, the beautiful things in life, the pleasurable things, taste all the sweeter. So this is something that, I write about a lot in my own philosophy, is that to enjoy life, to as Nietzsche would put it, to affirm life in its totality, we do have to experience pain, amor fati. We have to love our fate. We have to accept things as they are. So we have to deal with the bad things for the good things to also be enjoyable. Otherwise, we end up being a decadent, hedonistic, bourgeois individual who just has pleasure, but their pleasure is really sort of superficial, and it's not that enjoyable. There's a big difference between the dopamine you get from shooting up heroin and then the dopamine that Caesar gets when he's walking down through Rome with his face painted red and golden laurels on his head. There's that, you can't touch that, right? That's a separate plane. That's this sort of, in my philosophy, I talk about the material being turned into the metaphysical. That's essentially what it is, right? And that's what's happening there. But with the purely sort of nihilistic, just physical desire for comfort and pleasure, you lack that ability to transcend into the metaphysical realm, to create something. We talked about sacrifice, for example, the sacrifice for victory, in which a hero becomes a god, almost, or a legend, right? Where a man becomes a legend, because that's this transcendence from just being a man, a material piece of flesh, and then becoming that higher being, that sort of higher spiritual entity, and that's something that I think Jünger is trying to point out. But he's also pointing out, I think, one of the more pessimistic views that I see in Jünger is, he talks about this a lot in The Worker, the sort of death of the warrior class and the rise of a mass worker type class, which may not exactly be pessimistic, but he is sort of seeing that to be competitive in the world stage, you do need the worker type that is willing to fight, is willing to fulfill their role in society, is prepared to experience pain, is willing to sacrifice for the higher ideals, right? And is a type. There's a type of person. They're all a uniform group, part of a society. But also, I think within this what I deem as a pessimistic viewpoint. There is a certain beauty that's lost when when you need that type, where you need the masses organized a specific way to be successful. One of the things I like about Evola, for example, is this sort of belief in the warrior class, right? And I think what you really need to do is find this balance between maintaining the beauty of hierarchy, the beauty of certain people, certain individuals, being more gifted, being more driven, and also ensuring that you're maximizing, through meritocracy, you're maximizing the most capable individuals in a society. It's like, you go to Plato's Republic, for example. You want to make sure all the golden children are in positions where they can benefit the collective group, right? So I think there's a lot of things to unpack and balance within that, right? But this is just a kind of brief summary of On Pain. I think I'll do another video on this in the future, but yeah, this channel is sort of just to start to get my ideas out there. I have my book coming out on December 2nd, and I just want to start posting here to get my ideas out there before the book comes out. I'll be doing updates on that. But yeah, this is just the first video. See where this goes, see how this goes. Do another one on Pain. I'll probably do a video on Sun and Steel, some videos on Nietzsche, Evola, and lots more. So yeah, this is the first little video for the channel, and hope you enjoyed it. Hope you learned a little bit, and tell me your relationship with pain, and I will tell you who you are. Have a good one.